Okay, well, we might get started. We know you've all got commitments. And my name is Paula Benson. I'm the General Manager of Corporate Responsibility here at the NAB. And you'll forgive me, it's day 4 of my role here at NAB, so I only just found my way here myself. But I do know that NAB has a long-standing and very proud relationship with the Lowy Institute, and we're absolutely delighted to have Andrew Shearer, the Director of Studies, here with us today. As many of you would know, Andrew has made a significant contribution to foreign policy in Australia. He has served as an advisor to former Prime Minister John Howard and former Minister for Defence Robert Hill, as well as having had a distinguished career of public service both in Australia and in Washington DC in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and the Office of National Assessments. We all know we live in challenging times, and the world of the 21st century is markedly different to that of the past century. Our relationship with the US has in many ways been part of the Australian psyche, our identity, and of course our economy and national security have been inextricably linked. It has certainly been one of our strongest and most strategic relationships, but where to from here? It gives me great pleasure to introduce Andrew Shearer and to hear his thoughts about the US alliance in what he describes as Australia's new era of strategic uncertainty. Thanks, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much, Paula, for such a kind introduction, and thanks everyone for coming today. I'd like to acknowledge, before I start though, NAB's very generous support for the Lowy Institute. We're deeply appreciative of everything that NAB does for us, and in particular for NAB's support for this Food for Thought series, which is very important in our efforts to deepen and broaden our engagement in Melbourne and demonstrate that we're truly a national institution. My topic today is the Australia-US alliance, and specifically the role of the alliance in what I believe will be a very different, much less certain, and possibly much less benign strategic environment for Australia over the next few decades. On the 1st of September this year, it will be 60 years since the ANZUS Treaty was signed in San Francisco. My presentation today is one of a series of Lowy Institute events commemorating that landmark event in Australian foreign policy. Rather than dwelling on the past, however, I intend to focus today mostly on some of the current and future challenges facing the alliance, particularly flowing from the rise of China, and to analyse some of these challenges, including through the prism of Australian public attitudes. As my title suggests, my contention today is that the strategic waters we're about to navigate are becoming murkier and potentially much less tranquil than we're used to. For over 60 years now, Australia has enjoyed a period of relative regional stability, underpinned by American power. Since the Battle of Midway in 1942, the US Navy has enjoyed unchallenged control of the Western Pacific. Resting on the foundation of 4 deployed US military forces, alliances and deterrence, this Pax Americana created the conditions for the Asian economic miracle, seeing off the external threat posed by the Soviet Union, tamping down regional rivalries, managing the reintegration of Japan, and freeing the countries of East Asia to allocate their national resources to productive development rather than to costly spending on defence. The results were spectacular. Relative peace for over half a century, hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty and the creation of a massive Asian middle class, a surge in intra-regional trade and investment, and successful democratic transitions across the region, including in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan and Indonesia. For post-war Australia, the alliance played another crucial role. As my friend from Flinders University, Malcolm Cook, points out, with the wounds of the Second World War still raw, the alliance gave Australia's political leaders the strategic confidence to reach out to its former enemy and sign the far-sighted 1957 Commerce Agreement, paving the way for the economic partnership that in many ways created the modern Australian economy and spearheaded our engagement with Asia. Far from a liability in Asia, the alliance has been a key basis for Australia's deepening strategic relations, not only with Japan, but with South Korea, and potentially now India and Indonesia. Now, however, for the first time in over half a century, America's strategic and economic primacy in Asia is being contested. I'm not a US declinist, and I'm inclined to pay as much attention to China's many weaknesses as to its obvious strengths. I note that today's papers are full of reports worrying about the state of the Chinese economy. In my view, Australian commentators often seriously underestimate the resilience of American power and exaggerate China's weight. But even so, there's no question that the rise of China and India is changing the regional strategic equation for Australia. Moreover, for the first time in our history, we face the situation where our largest trading partner is neither a developed nation nor a democracy, nor part of the Western alliance system. Increasingly, our strategic commentators are seeing our alliance obligations clashing with, or at a minimum diverging from, our longer-term economic interests. These currents are apparent in Australian public attitudes too. Public opinion shapes and constrains the policy choices available to government, including in foreign policy. Often the Australian elite likes to disparage public opinion and bemoan the ignorance of the broader community. But the fact that more than 7 million Australians travel each year, and also the Lowy Institute's annual polling, suggests that Australians are in fact more engaged with and better informed about the outside world than we may assume. I'll go further today and argue that their views display a good deal of common sense when it comes to Australia's international interests, striking a shrewd balance between principle and pragmatism. This year's Lowy poll asked more detailed questions about public attitudes towards the US alliance and China than any of our previous polls. The results, I think, are very revealing. The poll showed a continuing growth in the warmth of Australian attitudes towards the United States, up from 60 degrees in 2007 to 70 degrees in 2011. Now, boosters of President Obama and many denigrators of his predecessor naturally attribute this to the change of US administration in 2008. No doubt there was something of an Obama bounce. But the rest of the poll suggests something structural and therefore much more important for the longer term is going on. The real key is the trend in respondents who believe Australia's alliance relationship with the United States is very important for Australia's security. This has continued to rise steadily from 36% in 2007 to 59% in 2011. More than 80% of Australians say the alliance is either very or fairly important for Australia's security. As I said earlier, attitudes to the alliance reveal a fascinating mix of principle and pragmatism. Nearly 80% of Australians agree the alliance is an extension of common values, a proposition that attracted the most support out of 7 different propositions in the poll about the alliance. This is particularly interesting in light of the traditional assumption in Australian international relations scholarship that Australians place more emphasis on realism than on idealism. Australians certainly talk about values in different terms than Americans, but this finding suggests it's time to reconsider some of our assumptions and that values are very much front and centre in the way that Australians think about foreign policy. At the same time, the poll also highlights a strong streak of hard-headed Australian pragmatism. 3/4 of Australians agree that without the alliance, Australia would have to spend much more on defence. So what is driving this structural shift in Australian public attitudes towards the alliance? Our polling provides strong evidence that the main factor is Australia's increasingly uncertain regional strategic environment, and in particular, the rise of China and its more assertive external behaviour. A clear correlation is apparent between the rise in support for the US alliance over the past 5 years and an uptick in public concern about China's long-term strategic intentions. Since 2008, the proportion of respondents who believe that China's aim is to dominate Asia has risen from 60 to 65%. Even starker is the finding that 44% of Australians believe that China, now our leading trading partner, is likely or very likely to pose a military threat to Australia in the next 2 decades. This is consistent with polling right around the Asia-Pacific region, recording increased concern about China's growing military power and diplomatic assertiveness. The Australian public's strong support for the US alliance is far from unquestioning, however. Indeed, it seems to be informed by a very realistic appreciation of the costs and risks. It's noteworthy that support for the alliance has risen over the past 5 years, despite its prominence as a reason for Australia's participation in the controversial war in Iraq and in the increasingly unpopular conflict in Afghanistan. Notwithstanding these conflicts, over half would support making a military contribution to a US military operation in defence of South Korea against an attack from the north. Nearly 3/4 of Australians recognise that the alliance makes it more likely that Australia will be drawn into a war in Asia that is not necessarily in Australia's interests. Among those who considered China was likely or very likely to pose a military threat, some 87% said that this was because China and the United States are likely to come into conflict in the future, and Australia will end up being drawn in through the alliance. Right through the Cold War, a majority of Australians supported the alliance in the knowledge that it made Australia a nuclear target. Today, 55% would support basing US military forces in Australia. 43% are opposed, with the attendant danger that these facilities would be targeted in any conflict involving America. So can we draw any conclusions from this, including for policy? I believe we can. What emerges is a picture of an Australian public with a sensible grasp of strategic reality and basically sound instincts about how we should respond, a view considerably at odds with many recent academic prognostications. Australians are aware of the benefits of China's economic growth, but they're also aware that China's authoritarian political system and state-managed economy have significant implications not only for Beijing's treatment of its own people, but also for its international behaviour, for its long-term economic prospects, and for its ability to fulfil its national aspirations. Australians are concerned about China's poor adherence to human rights, are suspicious of foreign direct investment by Chinese state-owned entities, and are concerned about what China's recent military and diplomatic assertiveness may portend for its longer-term strategic behaviour. Hence their response to Australia's growing economic dependence on a country viewed with considerable ambivalence, if not mistrust, is to hew more closely to the security offered by the US alliance. In other words, a classic hedging strategy. According to our poll, nearly 60% of Australians believe the alliance makes Australia safer from attack or pressure from China. If we pull this off, in the second half of the 21st century, the alliance can once again give us the strategic confidence and strength to intensify our economic ties with a rising Asian power with whom, for various reasons, we have a mutual deficit of trust. In other words, the alliance could play a similar enabling role in the development of a successful Australian relationship with China in the first half of the 21st century to the pivotal one it played with respect to our highly successful engagement with Japan during the second half of the 20th century. Nor is Australia alone in facing this challenge. This is a strategy that finds an echo all around East Asia, where other countries are also looking to balance economic dependence on China with political and security independence from Beijing. It is no accident that Japan, South Korea, India, Indonesia, and even Vietnam, also countries with China as their largest or second largest trading partner, are looking to strengthen their security ties with America. To my mind, this is an indication that Hugh White, in his essay Power Shift, is on the wrong track. Why would Australia look to distance itself from Washington with all the costs of that and take a more equidistant position between the United States and China when our most important regional partners are doing precisely the opposite? Of course, none of this means that implementing such a strategy will be simple. In Australia's traditional grand strategy, our economic and strategic interests were generally in close alignment and hence were mutually supporting, an intellectually tidy arrangement that served the nation's interests very well for more than 200 years. But as Sino-American competition grows, as I believe it inevitably will, Australian diplomacy is going to be tested. Some commentators posit that Australia faces a defining choice between our alliance with the United States and our economic future with China, and agonise about finding just the right distance between the two. I disagree. With respect, we have already chosen. We chose in 1951 and we chose the United States. Of course, no one wants to see a major war between China and the United States. It would be costly and disruptive, with the potential to undo many of the Asia-Pacific region's gains in prosperity and stability over the last 60 years. Australia and other countries should work as hard as possible to avoid such an outcome. But to my mind, the notion that we could somehow stand aside from such a conflict But to my mind, the notion that we could somehow stand aside from such a conflict if it did happen is completely fanciful, as is the suggestion that our interests would be served by encouraging the United States to reduce its presence in the Western Pacific in order to avoid it. Indeed, the latter course is more likely to lead to conflict than to prevent it. As Prime Minister, John Howard, who I should underline as a disclaimer was my former boss, succeeded in strengthening both Australia's alliance with the United States and the relationship with China, famously inviting the US and Chinese presidents to address the Australian Parliament on successive days. Yet Howard consistently made clear that our partnership with the United States would always be more important because of our shared values, strategic interests and history. In his recent best-selling memoir, Howard wrote that while Australia should make every effort to avoid a conflict between China and America, quote, "I always knew that, come a showdown between China and the United States, Australia would align itself with the United States," unquote. Since 2007, Labor has, ironically, given Kevin Rudd's apparent credentials, had less success in managing relations with China, Japan and India. Nonetheless, both Rudd and Gillard have made it clear, both by their words and their actions, that the US alliance remains the cornerstone of Australian strategic thinking. The Rudd government's 2009 Defence White Paper displeased Chinese officials by drawing attention to the destabilising consequences of China's military modernisation. Gillard caused similar irritation in Beijing during her visit to Japan earlier this year, when she committed to stronger defence ties and indicated she would discuss the security implications of China's rise with her Japanese counterpart. An increasingly assertive China is always quick to play the containment card as a device to divide the United States and its allies. But Australia and its other partners in Asia should not fall for this. At issue is nothing less than our ability to maintain full independence of decision-making, that is, our sovereignty. It's imperative that Australia retains the freedom and capacity to make its own security choices. Already, though, we're exhibiting worrying signs of self-censorship. Prime Minister Gillard caved into diplomatic pressure not to meet the Dalai Lama. Commentators, academics and business people tend to take China's side in any bilateral dispute. Hugh White urges that we should persuade the United States to go easy on China and cause no trouble, and that we limit our own military capabilities for fear of provoking China. But why should we, unless China has a desire to threaten us or our friends, or to change the status quo in ways which disadvantage us? It's entirely legitimate for like-minded countries to work together to maintain the existing stable and open regional order. As a substantial beneficiary of that order, indeed Australia has a responsibility to support it. And with the United States under increasing financial duress, it's appropriate that Australia and other nations that have benefited so much from that order step up their own contributions of public goods to the region, as they have recently in response to national disasters. Nor can China realistically object to like-minded nations with a major stake in the liberal international order discussing and coordinating their approaches to dealing with the manifold implications of China's rise, whether for global trade and finance, the environment or international security. As China's power grows, the most effective way for Western nations to influence its behaviour will be to work together. This may be balancing, but it is not containment, a specific term for the Western alliance's Cold War strategy to isolate the Soviet Union politically and economically, and eventually to roll back its influence. Far from it. US and Australian policy remains to engage China more fully in global and regional economic and political institutions such as the G20 and the East Asia Summit. We understand that China is different from the Soviet Union, since Beijing is not promoting its own route to development or its own social and political structures as a model for others, as did Moscow, at least not so far. The key in our dealings with China is to lay down a clear framework for the relationship and to stick to it. China's leaders are hard-headed and transactional. We err when we are not, and instead become sentimental or unrealistic about China. Consistency and firmness are essential. We can't afford to send mixed messages sucking up to Washington and Beijing whenever our ministers are in each capital and telling each what they want to hear. Predictability is what China is looking for. Then it can adjust its expectations appropriately and we can avoid unnecessary hiccups. Kevin Rudd himself was a mixed message, for example. He oversold himself as a China expert able to move relations with China to a new level. But to his credit, he actually had quite a hard-headed view of China, which Beijing did not expect. The result was uneven expectations, a demonstration that you can't say one thing at home and then another thing abroad. We should emphasise too that we want a constructive relationship with China where our interests intersect. With the synergies between our two economies the most obvious example. But we also need to be mindful of the real strengths and advantages we bring to the relationship, and very clear with Beijing that we're not going to compromise on our core strategic interests or on our values. The US alliance is front and centre in each of these respects. Few Australians or Americans outside government circles appreciate the extent to which the Australia-US security relationship has developed, particularly in the decade since 9/11. The relationship has always been strong, no matter which party is in power, in Canberra or in Washington, built on shared strategic interests in the Asia-Pacific region, a common view that global security is ultimately indivisible, and a recognition that a country's security is much broader than just its territorial defence. Over decades, these attributes have manifested in long-standing intelligence links, regular high-level combined military exercises and deployments, and close defence industrial collaboration. But in the last decade or so, the level of military, intelligence and diplomatic coordination between the two countries has been taken genuinely to a new level. Australians like to deprecate our international weight, yet American officials, whether Democrat or Republican, routinely bracket Australia with the United Kingdom as the United States' closest ally. Some even put us ahead. There's plenty of empirical evidence for this proposition. Australian and American intelligence and security officials have worked hand in glove in the global war on terror. Australian Special Forces have been fully integrated with US operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Australian fighter aircraft flew combat missions with US and other allied aircraft in Iraq. And the ADF is now embedded not only in the conduct but also in the planning of coalition operations. Australian military officers have occupied some of the most senior and trusted positions in recent coalition operations, including Chief of Operations to the US Commander in Iraq, General Casey, and Commander of a coalition fleet operating in the northern Persian Gulf. Australia has been an active participant in the Proliferation Security Initiative and a range of combined exercises, including the US-India-led Malabar series. For over a decade now, the Australian government has placed a premium when making major defence acquisition decisions on strengthening the ADF's ability to operate seamlessly with its US counterpart. This logic drove capability decisions, including the M1 tanks, C-17 transport aircraft, air warfare destroyers with Aegis combat systems, the Joint Strike Fighter, and the Link 16 communications and targeting system. At last year's AUSMIN talks, Australian and US foreign and defence ministers agreed to strengthen cooperation in cybersecurity and space. As a result of strong political leadership and commitment on both sides, much of this enhanced defence and security cooperation was institutionalised during the last decade. Australia is the only nation apart from Britain to enjoy access to virtually all US intelligence material, an exemption from US national disclosure policy, access to US classified information systems, and a treaty with the United States guaranteeing our companies streamlined access to US defence industrial technology. The ADF now enjoys a sort of intimate, familiar relationship with the US Central Command in Tampa, Florida, that we once enjoyed only with Pacific Command in Honolulu, and has developed strong links with other commands, including Strategic Command, responsible for the increasingly important domains of space and cyberspace. Indeed, I would argue that what we are seeing is an increasing level of de facto integration of Australia's defence capabilities with those of the United States. Every time an ADF ship sails or an aircraft flies, it does so in a privileged bubble of information dominance provided largely by the United States. This edge is vital for a remote country with a small population and will only become more important to us as modern precision-guided weapons and other highly capable systems become more and more prevalent in our region. Over the next decade, the alliance will become more, not less, important to Australia. It will also demand more of Australia for several reasons. I've dealt at some length with the first reason, the rise of China. I've also mentioned the second, which is the proliferation of modern weapons that's going to make for a much more contested and much less benign operating environment. This change is not in the distant future, but underway now, and will start to have real implications for Australia's force structure this decade. The third reason, also related to the rise of China, is that, like it or not, great power competition is on the rise in Asia. And the epicentre of this regional competition is gravitating southward towards Australia, as distinguished US naval scholar Toshi Yoshihara highlighted in a recent essay for the Lowy Institute. Australia's central position between the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific theatre will only become more important as Chinese and Indian naval forces grow and project further west and east respectively, as energy insecurity continues to rise and as transnational challenges such as terrorism, piracy and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction endure. The fourth reason is that US expectations of Australia are likely to rise because other US traditional allies will be doing less and because of the dire budget situation of the United States itself. During his final weeks in office, the widely respected former US Secretary of Defence, Robert Gates, delivered a withering critique of declining European defence spending and capabilities. The UK government, having inherited a spiralling budget deficit, has cut defence spending by 8%, with the impact falling disproportionately on expeditionary capabilities. The UK Army will lose one of its 6 deployable brigades. The Obama administration itself is seeking to cut the US defence budget by $400 billion, which can only affect capabilities needed to maintain the US military edge in our part of the world. For Australia, one uncomfortable consequence of these developments is that US military planners will have no choice but to look to others to pick up the slack the next time they're looking to put together a coalition operation. And Australia is likely to find itself in a smaller and smaller club of willing and able participants. Another reality for Australia is that maintaining forces capable of operating with the world's most sophisticated military is a complex and expensive business. Australia's defence organisation, budget, personnel and acquisition systems are already under significant strain. Yet a more contested and threatening regional operating environment will add further demands on the ADF. The proliferation of missiles, submarines and cyber warfare capabilities in Asia means that we will have to spend more on advanced missile defence, anti-submarine warfare and intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance systems, such as Global Hawk unmanned aerial vehicles. We'll have to go much further in integrating these systems so they work seamlessly together in real time. Moreover, we'll have to go one step further and develop the ability to operate these systems in combination not only with American, but also with Japanese, South Korean and possibly Indian forces in the future. As Asia's strategic landscape changes, the United States is looking to diversify its regional military footprint, with less emphasis on large bases in Northeast Asia and more on other forms of access, further south and west. This is bringing Australia further into the frame as a possible location for supporting US forces. Existing defence facilities in Northern and Western Australia could host extended deployments and exercises by US naval vessels, aircraft and Marines, as well as pre-positioned heavy equipment. In my view, this would make an important contribution to maintaining regional stability during an uncertain period in our neighbourhood. The Lowy poll indicates that a majority of Australians would support it, and any sensitivities among Australia's neighbours would be manageable, not least, as I've indicated, because they share many of our own concerns. Accordingly, this is a proposal that I think is very much in Australia's interest. In conclusion, I just wanted to say that this alliance that I've described today is a very different one from the one conceived by Percy Spender and John Foster Dulles all those years ago. But it's one built very much on the same enduring foundations. The United States is moving rapidly beyond its traditional preference for a hub and spokes alliance system in Asia. Today, Washington's actively encouraging the development of a network of like-minded partners who have both the political will and the ability to contribute materially to maintaining a favourable balance of power in a rapidly changing region. Today, Australia's comfortable days as a largely passive southern anchor are behind us. Shifting global power balances, enduring geography, shared interests and common values in combination are increasing Australia's strategic importance, and with it the importance of the Australia-US alliance. This means the opportunity for Australia for increased influence, both in Washington and in our own region. Far from being a liability in Asia, a strong alliance gives us leverage, but it also brings added responsibility. Australia today is a much more mature, capable and self-confident nation than it was in 1951. We are not a distant spectator. This is our region, our future. It's up to us to shape the agenda and to set the pace so that the alliance remains relevant and dynamic. thereby helping to ensure that Australia and our neighbours continue to prosper in a peaceful region. If we do step up, the Australia-US alliance can make an even more valuable contribution in maintaining peace and stability in the next 60 years than it has in the last 60 years. Thank you. I'd like to invite questions now. We have just over 20 minutes, and I would ask that when I acknowledge you, you wait for Jackie to hand you the microphone, and also that you announce your name and affiliation, because we're podcasting this event today. Thanks.
Robert Gottliebson, businessspectator.com.au. Thanks for a fantastic address. It was very good. As I would read the play, our air power in the region for recent decades pivoted on the F-111. And the plan was, and still is, that in the next decade, the JSF will be the key aircraft. Unfortunately, the independent evaluators that have studied this aircraft have discovered that it is nowhere near as good as the Russian-Indian aircraft, and probably not as good as the Chinese aircraft. And the Indonesians are buying about 100 of the Russian-Indian aircraft. Given the scenario that you've painted, we will no longer have air power in the region. This adds a great deal more danger than you'd otherwise imagine. Do you agree with that?
I certainly agree that the region is becoming more dangerous for the reasons I outlined very briefly, and I didn't want to get too much into the sort of military wonkery today. But let me just say about the Joint Strike Fighter a couple of things. It's true that the Joint Strike Fighter program is subject to some significant delays and some significant cost overruns, and those are unfortunate. But it's interesting, and you mentioned the F-111, that program was bedeviled by exactly the same problems, and everyone used to think the F-111 was a white elephant or a lemon or whatever, and yet it underpinned our air strike capability for half a century almost. I'm not a aeronautical engineer, but I would point out about some of those criticisms of the Joint Strike Fighter that they're more or less confined to its dogfighting capability. My own view about that is if we're in a situation where the Royal Australian Air Force is dogfighting off our coast, then we've got far bigger problems than whether or not the JSF's the best fighter aircraft we could buy. The point of the JSF is that it's a multi-role aircraft that's very capable in a whole lot of domains, and also that many of its capabilities have not, to be fair to the aircraft, been tested yet. So, slightly long-winded answer, but I remain, I'm concerned about delays and cost overruns, but I still think the JSF is going to be the best aircraft that Australia could buy for its future needs. Nick Bisley down the front here.
Hi, Nick Bisley from La Trobe University. Thanks, Andrew, for a characteristically optimistic and yet pessimistic view of the future. And I share a lot of your perceptions, but I guess I've got two questions. One is to do with kind of spirals of rivalry, which is to say, I agree, we've doubled down with the US, and we made our choice a long time ago, and the arguments about having to choose are silly. But it seems to me that the risks of strengthening the alliance, one of the things that I think is going to come with it is it's going to likely fuel senses of rivalry and spirals of insecurity. And I was wondering what your sense of how that can be managed. I mean, I think that's inevitable, but it's not to say it's necessarily unmanageable. I wonder how it can be managed. The other question, I think, is the money question, which is to say, I think you're spot on that the alliance system cannot remain as it is if it's going to produce regional stability. It needs to be changed, and the partners need to do more, and that means they need to spend more. and I can't see who's going to do it. I can't see the Japanese doing it. I can't see the South Koreans willing to spend to do things beyond the peninsula. It's pretty difficult to imagine fiscal circumstances in Australia which would allow that over the next 10 years, at least ones that you could politically sell. So I wonder where you think the money's going to come from.
Two excellent questions. On the spiral point, I'm not with John Mearsheimer, who, as you know, Nick, believes that inevitably China and the United States are destined to have a sort of major hegemonic war to sort out the hierarchy. I don't buy that. But I do travel with him as far along that road as acknowledging that they are destined to have, I think, a very deep, long-running, expensive strategic competition. So as you say, the key becomes how do you manage that? I guess my approach, the approach I've outlined today, is that we develop a strategy, and I think actually we've been pursuing it, which is half optimistic and half pessimistic. As I said, Australia, the United States, Japan, South Korea, all the countries I've mentioned continue to support China's active integration with the international economic system and international political institutions, and we should keep doing that. But at the same time, we should work together with like-minded countries to remind China what the rules are, and ultimately, and everyone hopes it won't come to this, but where necessary to enforce the rules diplomatically, legally, and if necessary, militarily. And my sense, actually, in the sort of long historical sweep and also in the day-to-day tactical sense, that China actually responds, as I said in my presentation, to consistent messages and to unified positions by like-minded countries. And I don't have a better answer than that. I actually think your second point is a bigger problem, a capacity point. I said I don't think the US is in decline, but it's hard to look around the Western world today and not be a trifle pessimistic, isn't it? I mean, Europe's a basket case, or at least the southern part. Germans are fed up with paying for it. Japan, say no more. US. I mean, it's a pretty bleak. It's a pretty bleak picture. All I can say about that is I remain an optimist about the fundamentals of the Western system and the liberal economic and political model, and I think that those societies are hugely resilient and they have sufficient advantages that they will bounce back. And I think the burden is going to be shared less evenly, but you can make an argument that countries other than Australia for a long time bore more of the load when the imminent threat, if you like, was in the European theatre. And Australia, we contributed, but we weren't a main player. I guess the thrust of what I'm saying is we are going to have to step up. We're going to have to spend more on defence. And that means, some hard choices in terms of domestic policy, I guess. So.
Thanks very much. John Langmore from the University of Melbourne. I think, as you say, the alliance is unquestioned, but there are questions about the extent of agreement within the alliance. Clearly, our interests are not identical with those of the United States. If we are the mature, capable, self-confident country that you mentioned, and I think you're right, there is scope for us to act sometimes autonomously within the alliance, and many would say we should have done that in relation to Iraq and perhaps in other situations as well. We were certainly misled by American intelligence during Iraq. So we have to think for ourselves. What scope do you think there is for that?
Yeah, I don't agree with. I don't disagree. Sorry, with the premise. I'll probably disagree a little with some of the specifics. I mean, on Iraq, it wasn't just American intelligence that misled us. It was French and Russian intelligence as well. And some of the findings of the UN weapons inspectors and British. And I don't want to debate Iraq here. I think your point, though, is right. And there are times when we have different interests, and perhaps more often a different interpretation of those interests than the United States. All I can say is I don't accept the characterisation that Australia sort of blindly follows the US. I said earlier that Australians deprecate our own weight, and I think, frankly, Australians would be very surprised at how robust a lot of our diplomacy in Washington is, and how, if you like, ruthlessly we have used the leverage that we've got from the alliance in Washington. You know, a lot of my senior friends, Democrats and Republicans alike, sort of smile ruefully and say that, you know, we're masters at playing this alliance game and getting benefits out of the alliance that way offset the actual investments we make. You know, we've convinced the US to come our way on different issues from time to time. So I mean, you're absolutely right. There are times when we take a different view of our interests and we pursue them more autonomously. But my overall point is that, and I think I've presented some good evidence for that when we engage our region or we engage the international system more broadly, we do it from a position of strength because of the alliance, not weakness. Des.
Thank you very much for a comprehensive discussion and presentation. You referred just in passing more or less to cutbacks in troop forces by the UK and also the US and the weakness in Europe. Are we moving into a situation somewhat like the one that developed in the Second World War, where deterrence, particularly from the availability of nuclear weapons, is becoming or likely to become more important? And if so, should we, that's Australia, give consideration to acquiring nuclear weaponry?
Short answer is yes and no, comma, not just yet. I am. In a world like I've sketched out, where your conventional military edge is being eroded, military science would tell you that the relative role of nuclear deterrence will become more important. That said, my view is that US strategic nuclear deterrence will remain sufficiently credible, certainly over the next 20 years, absent the United States doing something really silly with its nuclear weapons, like cutting them radically. But that aside, I think US nuclear deterrence will remain sufficiently robust over that period that we don't need to start thinking about that yet. Should we rule it out for all times? I think the answer is no, and I'm prepared to be sort of held down, but I've had this argument with a number of my colleagues that a country in our circumstances would be foolish to say no for all time to something when we really don't know what's coming down the pike towards us. Sir in the third row.
Mike McCluskey from ABC Radio Australia, and just on the level of consistency of message that we need to give to China, which is a really wonderful point that you've been making, is it possible that the recent consistent message to China is military aggression on behalf of the United States and the alliance indeed, and that through Afghanistan and Iraq, the message we're actually sending to China is you must build your military capability because we are aggressive?
I've certainly heard Chinese scholars mount that argument, and not that long ago an official Chinese statement made the point that the United States should welcome cuts to the US defence budget and encourage the US to go further. Nice try, I thought, was my reaction. I mean, this is a very sort of complex situation we're describing here, but the reality is that that it's China that's growing its capabilities. The United States is essentially responding. For the last year and a half, US allies and non-allies indeed, right around Asia, including Vietnam, a country at war with the United States 30 years ago, has been encouraging the US to increase its military presence in the South China Sea and other parts of the Western Pacific. The US, in my view, has reacted to that, but it hasn't been leading the charge and looking to change the status quo. The status quo is changing because of China. Now, part of the reason it's changing is that China's growing very rapidly, and rapidly growing powers develop modern militaries. We all know that. I think the troubling thing, and I didn't go into it in my speech, but the troubling thing is there are a number of Chinese capabilities that have only one purpose. It's one thing for a country to develop a modern balanced force for a range of contingencies. China's developing anti-satellite systems to target US satellites. It's developing ballistic missiles to target US aircraft carriers and other surface ships. And it's rapidly building one of the world's biggest and most capable submarine forces, again with the purpose clearly of pushing the US away from waters which, as I said, it's dominated since 1942. So, I don't want to get into a fault thing, and this is the kind of Mearsheimer point. This is the tragedy of great power politics. This is the security dilemma. But there's enough historical evidence, I think, that kind of unilateral disarmament, which I probably had a couple of implicit swipes at in my speech, is not the answer, sadly. And the answer, to my mind, has to be to continue asking China why it's developing systems that only have this one, quite aggressive purpose, and working to put in place what are called in the trade confidence building measures so that you don't get the worst outcome, which is a kind of World War I outcome where countries which have no intention of going to war end up kind of colliding and being drawn inexorably, as it were, into conflict. That's the worst outcome, and something we should be working very hard to avoid. So,
G'day, Arnoing. Quite a refreshing speech with some really interesting implications, which you touched on and some others have as well. The beauty about alliances for a smaller nation is it lets you get a free ride on the cheap. And I would argue that for a long time, the fallback position for the defence of Australia has been dial 1-800-USA. The question I've got is, with the implications for the future, whether we stay in the alliance or you get out, either way you have to spend more. And given the consistent underfunding of defence, especially over the last few years, especially in regards to GDP, how is that going to play with the Australian public? And was that asked in your poll?
We haven't asked specifically about attitudes to rising defence spending, and it's a good suggestion for next year's poll. I think there's enough evidence that I sort of went through, hopefully not in too much detail, but I think there's quite compelling evidence that Australians are nervous about this, and also that they will support increased defence spending. John Howard in 1996, when he came into office and faced a very bad budget outlook, 1996, remember, pre-9/11, made one critical decision in the decisions that led to the abolition of the budget deficit in 2 years. He quarantined defence spending. He came to office with a long-held view that we weren't spending enough on defence, and he set us on a path of 3% real growth in defence spending that continues today and is now is just now starting to taper off. I was going to make a party political point and say that Labor governments always get around to cutting defence eventually. So yes, I mean, I think though we'd have to spend vastly more if we get out of the alliance. And I'm intrigued by some of the commentators who think that we can have it both ways. We can kind of keep the, phone a friend option in our back pocket, but no, we don't want to get involved in, US military plans for contingencies in Asia, and we don't want to get drawn into disputes between China and the US, etc., etc. I mean, it's just not the real world. You're either in an alliance or you're not, and you can't have kind of alliance a la carte. It does mean spending more. We're not spending enough on defence. I hope I made that implicit. I'm happy to make it explicit. 1.78% of GDP is not going to be enough. And the idea that you can just keep spending the same as you always have, because that's how the budget lines work best, is silly when the world's changing around you in the profound ways that I've outlined.
Julie Reid from Institute of International Affairs. You began your talk about talking about public opinion. I'm interested that we hear very, very little in our press, which would form our public opinion for the layman in the street, about Chinese naval action in particularly the Southwest Pacific, and quite important trade routes for this nation. And how do we get that more on the, in the press, because it just doesn't seem to make it. We hear about South China Sea, but we don't hear about our region.
Thanks, Julie. It's an excellent point and a little chance for me to make a bit of a plug for the work that the Lowy Institute's Melanesia program does under Jenny Hayward-Jones' excellent leadership, trying to spotlight these issues in Australia, issues that tend to get lost in the drama of the Arab Spring and, rise of China and everything else that's happening out there. And it remains our backyard, and it remains, it's very pertinent to the US alliance, because there's no question the Americans look to us to keep our backyard tidy. It's one of the realities that alliances are about division of effort and labour, and that's the expectation, and we've had to do that from time to time. So you're right, it should be more important. We've also just recently put out a very substantial monograph called Crisis and Confidence, which is about maritime dynamics in Asia and this changing picture that I've tried to outline today, by Rory Metcalf and Ral Heinrichs and Justin Jones, our former Navy fellow. So I'd commend that to people who are interested in these topics. I think we have time probably for one more question if anyone has one. Sir, in the third row.
Dennis O'Neill, friend of Lowy. My question is to go back to your strategic premise about the expansion of China and the inevitability of some headbutting with the US. And I would just like to posit another issue that I feel could equally conspire to the sorts of tensions that you're alluding to. Pakistan has been identified as the fastest growing nuclear weapons state at the moment because of its increased production of plutonium and the directions in which that plutonium will be put to use. And notwithstanding a degree of détente between Pakistan and India, is that not a strategic situation which in itself could loom in a more fragile way and much larger than just the steady expansion of China based on its economic growth and its increased wealth? And draw China through its alliance or its friendships, if you like, with Pakistan into a much more complex South Asian imbroglio.
Yeah, Pakistan is, I think, the kind of nightmare foreign policy issue for most practitioners. If you talk to the commander of the American military in the Pacific, or he came through the Lowy Institute, I think, last year, and this was the thing he said that keeps him awake at night. It's Pakistan, it's not really North Korea or China or Taiwan or any of that, because of its sheer unpredictability. Of course, there is a link to the broader great power competition I'm talking about. I mean, Pakistan didn't sort of pick up nuclear weapons capability in the street. It got it from China, and that was part, I'm afraid, of a deliberate Chinese strategy to keep India tied down and preoccupied with its immediate neighbour in a very nasty little standoff there that's got, a terrorist dimension, a nuclear weapon dimension. I mean, it is almost, it's the wicked problem that the scholars talk about. And I'm not going to pretend to have any solution to that here. I think everyone needs to be sort of exerting more pressure on Pakistan, but we know just from recent events how hard that is to do and how hard a policy problem that is for the US and the rest of us. So you're absolutely right to signal it as a prominent issue, and I don't have any good answers, I'm afraid, today. Thanks. Well, thank you all for coming. It's great to see you all here in this continuation of our Food for Thought series, and I'm always enjoying to do this, but if you're new to this series and would like your details added to our list, please see Jackie on the way out. Likewise, more disappointingly, if you're not new to the series and would like to unregister, then please see Jackie too. Hopefully you won't be doing that. And we'll be in touch with details of our next event and look forward to seeing as many of you there as possible. Thanks for coming again.